And so we need to just relax and embrace what he is doing for us, believing that he's going to work it all out for our good. Hey everyone, it's your girl Radhika, and in today's episode, I'm going to be sharing some personal tips on how you can thrive during seasons of transition. Stay tuned. What I want to talk to you today about is transitions. What comes to your mind when you hear the word transition? Maybe you think change. Maybe you think frustration. Maybe you think discomfort. Maybe the word that comes to your mind is inconvenience. Maybe another word that comes to your mind are hardships and trials and challenges. Maybe in seasons of transition, there's ambiguity about, where are you going? What are you doing? And I wanted to share a definition with you. And I just looked this up in Webster's dictionary, and they define transition as the process or period of changing from one state or condition to another. So it is a process and it is a period. And so think through some processes and periods of times in your life where transition, seasons of change have come about, right? Maybe in your family, you had the birth of a child. Maybe you adopted a child. Maybe you decided to become a foster parent. Maybe you have launched a child and now you're becoming an empty nester. Your children are leaving the home. They're going away to college. And maybe you have gone through a season of fitness change and you are working out and you're exercising and you're changing your body mass index and all those good things and you're getting healthier. And we know that there is some discomfort with all of those things. Maybe a transition for you has been in the area of your finances. Maybe you have lost income due to a job change or job loss and other decisions that maybe have happened in your life where there has been a reduction in your income. And so all of those things can qualify as change, as seasons of change in your life. And there is an adaptation that is happening, and there is a processing that we go through as we experience these seasons of transition in our lives. And so what I wanted to do today is really share with you a perspective that I had to gain and learn and continue to remind myself of as I go through seasons of transition in my life. You think about synonyms for transition. I looked up, what are some other words that kind of mean the same thing as transition? And there are three words that stood out to me: transformation, shift, and progression. And so as I consider those words, I look back over my life and thought, okay, when I was going through seasons of transition, what shifts did I need to make? There were shifts in my perspective. That's probably the greatest thing that I can say I needed to shift during my seasons of transition. I had to shift the way I saw what I was experiencing in life. I had to get out of myself and out of my head and out of my own rational thinking and step back and take on God's perspective. God, what are you doing? What are you saying? What are you trying to do in my life? When I think about transformation, I can look back over seasons of transition and see that the Lord was transforming my character, the way I viewed myself, other people, and the way I viewed Him. It was also a season where I can look back and see progression. And a lot of times, we, again, as I just stated earlier, think that transition can be something that's negative. And here we see in the dictionary is that progression is a forward movement. How many of us actually think about transitions as something that's moving us forward, that we are covering ground? It is a positive momentum forward. And, as I began to look over my life and evaluate and process today, and I can say, yes, as I've shifted my perspective, as I have looked at the transformation in my character, and as I look at how I have progressed forward in my spiritual development, my emotional development, my leadership development, all these different areas of my life, I can say, God, yes, transition was for my good. You use every one of those seasons in my life to develop me and make me more like you, God. And so, my perspective, had to really shift. And, I have a couple notes here. It says, my perspective or view of transitions has changed. Now I see this process as a internal transformation rather than external frustration. I can now look at progression forward in God's plan rather than moving backward or having lost something. I'm actually gaining. I'm gaining ground. I'm gaining clarity. I'm gaining more momentum toward God's purposes for my life. And I began to shift my sense of power and control over my future. I had to shift from thinking that I am in control and I'm leading the charge on my life because I want to make sure that I live a life poured out, that I don't go to the grave with things that haven't been fulfilled. And what I had to realize, I had to make a shift in my understanding of that it is not my job to fulfill God's purpose and plan for my life. That is His role to fulfill the purposes and plans for my life. And so I had to make those shifts in my mind. And although transitions can be unexpected, they can be unplanned and even uncomfortable, I had to learn, and y'all, I'm still learning this, is that I need to see how God can show Himself strong in these unexpected, unplanned, and uncomfortable seasons of my life. He's not left me. He's not abandoned me, but He is moving me forward. He's transforming me. He wants to shift something in my life and my mind and my perspective. And so I'm going to share a couple shifts that I have had to make during these seasons of transition. And I'm sure you have some of your own. And so I had to shift my thinking from being inconvenienced to seeing these transitions as a God opportunity to advance me forward. I had to shift my thinking and that I had control over my life to allowing God to lead me in the direction of His choice for my life. I had to shift from wondering how in the world can this transition be good to shift my thinking to, you know what? God said He's going to work all things for my good. So I don't need to wonder, is any good going to come out of this? I already know what His promise says, that He's causing all things to work together for my good because I love Him and I've been called according to His purposes. I had to shift my thinking from I'm going to fulfill my plans for my future to God will fulfill His plans for my future. I had to shift from thinking that I needed to direct my steps to God will direct my steps. And you know, in Scripture, Psalms 37:23 says, and He delights in every detail of our lives. Just think about that. He takes delight in all these details of our lives. And so we can trust Him with that. I had to shift my thinking from I know the best pathway to get to where I need to go to acknowledging that God knows the best pathway for my life, as Psalms 32:8 says. I had to shift my thinking from God, this transition is a mess, to God is making my way perfect. It's not a mess. It's beautiful and it's perfect, as Psalms 18:32 says. And so I wanted to just share with you that the biggest thing I learned in transitions is that I needed to shift the way I viewed them, that it is actually something positive. It is for my growth. It's for my development. And I want to leave you with this acronym that I hope will encourage you during your seasons of transition. If you can take on this attitude, if you can take on this perspective, I believe that you will receive every promise and purpose and plan of God for your life. I know because I have been on the receiving end of this. And so I have lived this and I know it to be true. So lessons that I've learned during my seasons of transition. And so I'm going to use the word REAP as an acronym, REAP. The first thing that I learned in my seasons of transition is to recognize that God is writing my story. This is a God story. This is not a Rodica story. In Romans chapter 4, you can read all about Abraham and I can look at that example and see that, yes, I need to recognize that this is not about me. This is about God fulfilling His purpose for my life. And He is writing my story. I am not the author. Says that He's the author and the finisher of our faith. And so I had to put the pen down and stop writing my story and allow the Lord to write my story. So that's the R, recognize. Recognize that God is writing your story. The second letter is E for embrace and enter. I had to embrace and enter what God was doing for me. I had to surrender control and stop resisting and stop worrying about where this was going. Because you know what? God is not so concerned about where we're going. It's not about the destination. He is all concerned about who we are becoming. And are we becoming more like Him? Are we becoming imitators of Him? Do people see Him in us? And so Matthew 6:33 talks about not worrying about tomorrow, and the Message version talks about steeping ourselves in God initiative and God provision. He knows what we need in these seasons. And so we need to just relax and embrace what He is doing for us, believing that He's going to work it all out for our good. And so embrace and enter into what God is doing for you. The third letter is A, for accepting the fact that I had to accept the fact that it is not my role to fulfill the promises and the purposes and plans of God for my life. I had to accept the fact that it is God's job. It is His responsibility. And let me tell you what, once you can really receive that, it takes the pressure off of you to perform, to achieve, to strive. You don't need to do any of that. You don't need to worry about dying empty if you allow God and accept the fact that He's the one that's going to fulfill His purpose. And so there is a surrender, there is a trust that has to happen. And so that's the A, accept the fact that it's not your role, it's not my role to fulfill God's purpose for my life. I need to allow Him. It's His job to do that. And the last letter is P. I needed to learn how to place my trust, my faith, and my focus on God's promises, on God's character, on God's abilities and provision. And I had to remove my trust from myself, my abilities, my network, my initiatives. I had to truly place all my faith in Him, believing that His promises will come to pass no matter what I see and what I don't see. Again, if you read that passage in Romans chapter 4, Abraham knew that the promise of God, that he would be the father of generations so numerous that you couldn't even count them all. He knew that he wasn't able to do that. He was not able to have children. His wife was infertile. How in the world? He knew that this promise could not come to pass on anything that he could do. He just embraced God's promise of what he wanted to do. And so he placed his trust. He entered in to what God wanted to do. And I can tell you what, we saw the promise fulfilled in his life, and I've seen God's promises and purposes fulfilled in my life as I have done these 4 things. When I chose to recognize that God is writing my story, when I chose to embrace and enter into what God is doing for me, when I chose to accept the fact that I am not to fulfill the purpose for my life, but God is to do that. And when I chose to place my trust, my faith, and my focus on God's promises, God's provision, and God's plans, that's when I became a recipient of his pure gifts, of all his promises, of all his provision for my life. And so when I chose to enter that, we got to embrace what God is doing for us. And my decision, as we even read in Romans 4, it says that when Abraham entered in and embraced what God was doing for him, that was the turning point. And I'm here to tell you, just like Abraham, my story is the same. When I chose to recognize what God was doing and I entered and embraced what he was doing for me, guess what? That was the turning point for God's provision to show up in my life every time, you guys, every time. Whether it was a financial need, whether it was a family need, a need of my body, a need for a job, God showed up every single time. He never failed me. Was it easy to wait? In some seasons, absolutely not. Were there times where I was like, okay, God, you see what's going on? What you doing? But when I began to just say, you know what, I'm going to trust you no matter what I see. I'm going to stand on your promises. Guys, can I tell you, every single time he showed up, he never failed me. He always provided. And it always came in this amazing way that I never expected. There was no way that I could wire up the things that he has done. And so I just want to encourage you today in your season of transition. Recognize that God is writing your story. Embrace and enter into what he is doing for you, because he's doing something good for you. It's not to hurt you. Jeremiah 29:11, one of my favorite verses, says that he knows the plans he has for you. Plans to prosper you, not to harm you, to give you a future and a hope. And so when you embrace that, when you can relax in that, when you can become convinced that God's plans are good for me and he's going to work it all out, then you can really begin to be in a place, to be in position to receive the promise and provision and plans of God for your life. And so I just want to end by saying, if you're going through a transition in your life, I encourage you to reframe how you see your transition. See your transition as God moving you forward and closer to his purposes and plans for your life. See it as God is wanting to transform you into more of his likeness. See your transition as God wanting to work things out for your good. See it as God wanting to give you his good gifts, his good, pleasing, and perfect gifts. And I promise you, as you trust in him, as you believe in him, as you embrace all that he has for you, and if you choose to place your faith and your hope and your trust in him, he will not fail you. You are his child. You are his son. You are his daughter. And he promises that what he began in you, he will complete it. Stand on his word. Declare his promises. Do not be moved by what you see and what you don't see. Know that he is working all things out for your good. And the season of transition is actually a launching point to move you forward. I pray that you're encouraged today through my story. I'm a living witness. I'm a living testimony that when you recognize what God is doing, when you embrace it and you enter in through trust and faith, you will be able to receive his good provision and plans for your life. So stay encouraged, stay tuned. I hope this blesses you. Don't hesitate to inbox me, share with me how this has encouraged you. Share it with a friend who maybe is going through a transition and just needs to get some God perspective on it. So remember, when you choose to lead your life with more love, more care, and more compassion towards yourself and others, you are going to experience a more fulfilling and meaningful life. Make sure you like this podcast, drop me a comment below, and share with a friend.